Alright, so we're wrapping up some facts about the Tanakh, known as the Old Testament. So we did the Torah and the Nevi'im, and now we have the Ketuvim, or the writings. This would be the Book of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, Lamentations, Ruth, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Daniel, Ecclesiastes, and Chronicles. Okay, kicking it off with the Book of Psalms, which is very particular in that it's the only book in the Bible that is completely made of words to be sung with music. Some of them can be labeled as hymns, prayers, or poems. Whatever music they have been set to has been lost in time. Could have been classical or heavy metal. Just kidding. What hasn't been lost in most cases is the name of the author, each psalm, or at least the person to whom the psalm is associated with according to the text itself. There are 73 psalms attributed to King David, 12 to someone named Asaph, 11 to the sons of Korah, 2 to Solomon, 1 to Moses, 1 to Ethan the Ezrahite, and 1 to Haman the Ezrahite. 49 are anonymous, which brings the total of 150. Now, side note, there is a Psalm 151. It is attributed to David, and it's a short psalm found in most copies of the Septuagint, but not in the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible, and also found in some of the Peshitta manuscripts. The Eastern Orthodox, Coptic Orthodox, Armenian Apostolic, and Syriac Orthodox churches all accept Psalm 151 as canonical. Catholics and Protestants and most Jews consider it apocryphal, though you can find it in some editions of the Catholic Bibles. I believe even in some of the RSV versions, you can find it in there as well. What is clear about Psalms is that it can actually be split up into 5 similar books. This can help us figure out who wrote each psalm and when. Likely the majority of the psalms attributed to King David are found in Book 1. This part may very well be the oldest part of the collection. Just know that just because a psalm starts with the phrase, of David, doesn't mean David wrote it. This could also mean for David, which is the reading that most modern scholars prefer. Now, if you're looking for one of the more famous Davidic psalms, such as The Lord is my shepherd, the best place to look is Book 1. Now, Book 2 also has many psalms attributed to David, but in this section there's a very noticeable difference. Remember, the Yahwist and Elohist sources each use a different name for God. Yahwist used the personal 4-letter name that the Jews write but never pronounce. And the Elohist source uses the more general Elohim. Well, that happens here in Book 2. As opposed to Book 1, which uses the 4-letter name, there is a major shift that uses the word Elohim, very likely telling that each collection came from a different place and a different time. Book 2 is where we see that most of the Psalms are attributed to the sons of Korah. Now, Korah, who is known as Korun in the Quran, which was the cousin of Moses who rebelled against him, but his descendants went on to serve in the temple as Levites, and one of their duties was singing songs. Book 3 is where we find the 12 songs attributed to Asaph, which makes it very likely were all written by Levites known as the Asaphites, who, like the Korahites and Ezraites, were responsible for singing in the temple at the end of Book 3. After the last Asaph psalm, the name of God switches back to the 4-letter name for the rest of Book 3, 4, and 5. Now, Books 4 and 5 are where we find the majority of the anonymous psalms. Now, as far as the timeline of the psalms, most scholars believe they were definitely written before the exile, and some were definitely written after. Now, there are some parallels between psalms and other writings. You can compare the hymn of the praise to Ra in the Egyptian Book of the Dead to Psalms 8, as well as Psalms 104 compared to the great hymn to the Aten or Aten. Side note, the Book of Psalms is thought to be related to a lost book that the Muslims call the Zabur. According to the Quran, Allah revealed many books to many prophets over the centuries prior to the one received by Muhammad. One of them is called the Zabur and is said to have been revealed to David. Because of that, the Zabur is usually associated with the Psalms, but according to the Muslims, the Book of Psalms today is a corrupted version of the original work of the Zabur. Muslims believe something similar about the Torah. They believe God gave the Torah to Moses, but that the version we have today is not the original. Now, between the multiple source theory and the stance of modern scholars, there would be an argument of a corruption of original sources. There is definitely room for that perspective here, but currently there's no evidence from either archaeology or linguistic analysis that indicates any existence of older versions of the Torah and the Psalms which have become corrupted or lost. If one does believe this to be true, the idea is entirely theoretical and must be accepted based solely on belief without any historical evidence. Alright, up next we have the Book of Proverbs. This too is not a single book, but a collection of texts written by different people during different time periods. This one can be divided into 6 sections. Now, even though the book begins with the phrase, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, most scholars believe that the first 9 chapters are actually a prologue, likely added during the Persian period. The beginning here has 15 separate poems dealing with specific topics. The word proverb refers to a short wise saying, and therefore the Proverbs section of the book doesn't actually really start until chapter 10. This is where we start getting those one-liner bangers of wisdom. This section goes on to chapter 22, verse 17, and is very likely the original core of the book, either written by Solomon or attributed to Solomon as a means of establishing authority. Sections 3 and 4 are not associated with Solomon. Section 3 begins with the phrase, "Listen to the words of the sages," and gives 30 wise sayings. Section 4 begins with "These are also by the sages," and include 5 more. Now here's a very peculiar thing to know about Section 3. Is that a big portion of it corresponds directly with a work of ancient Egyptian literature known as the Instruction of Amenemopet, which dates to around 1000 BCE. Linguistic experts noticed the change in style and tone before and after this proverb, and therefore it's obvious that ancient Israelites recognized this Egyptian work as important and chose to include it alongside of the words of their own people. Alright, onto section 5 starts with these are more Proverbs of Solomon compiled by the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah. Likely these are all later additions attributed to Solomon, but written during the reign of King Hezekiah. Last but not least, section 6, we get 3 more final poems. One by Agur, son of Jacques, from Mesa, one written to Lemuel, king of Mesa, and the final one being anonymous. As to whether the king of Mesa is real or completely made up, nobody knows. So like Psalms, Proverbs is a collection of several different sayings and several poems by several different authors at several different times. Moving on, we have the book of Job, which is a nice clash of thoughts between a good God existing and horrible things happening to good people. Now, unlike most of the people in the Hebrew Bible, Job does not fit anywhere on the biblical family tree. Job is set outside of the land of Israel somewhere during the age of the patriarchs. Nobody knows when it was written, but we do know it has a very strange form of Hebrew and uses vocabulary words that don't show up anywhere else in the Tanakh. The current leading theory is that it was probably written during the Persian period by someone who spoke Aramaic as a first language and only knew a very old formal version of Hebrew. The next 5 books are grouped together in Jewish tradition and not ordered the same as the Christian tradition. The Jews lumped them together because they're all pretty short and are pretty late additions to the Hebrew Bible. So they're all literary in nature and not necessarily historical or theological. Each of these 5 books is associated with a particular Jewish holiday. Song of Solomon refers to Passover. Ruth refers to Shavuot, Lamentations with Tishav B'Av, Ecclesiastes with Sukkot, and Esther with Purim. Now, the Song of Solomon is the only book of the Bible that can be described as being erotic poetry, as the name suggests. There are large amounts of cosmological implications, and it could be argued this book very much deals with poetry about various constellations. Although associated with King Solomon, few scholars today actually believe Solomon is the author of it. When it was written is typically narrowed down by studying the vocabulary and grammar used in the text. It appears to be heavily influenced by Aramaic. Aramaic was the lingua franca of the Persian Empire, one that many different peoples could use and communicate with each other with. During the Persian period, it slowly replaced Hebrew as the main source of language in Judea. The Song of Solomon also shares a lot of similarities to love poetry written by the Greeks, and also out of all the books talked about so far, can likely be traced to the Greek period. So who wrote it? Nobody can prove that, but it was very common at the time to write something and put a famous person's name on it at the beginning. Next we have Ruth. In the Christian text, Ruth is typically after the book of Judges because chronologically this is where the story fits. But just like most of the books in the Ketuvim, the book of Ruth was written many hundreds of years after the time period in which it was set. Here's an analogy to that. Let's say you wrote a book about World War I. You weren't there, but somebody a millennium from now finds your book and writes about it assuming that you were alive in that time. That's what often happens with many of these texts. So who wrote Ruth? Nobody can say, but highly likely written during the Persian period, and the reason that is a pretty solid conclusion is because the topic concerns the marriage of an Israelite man to a non-Israelite woman, something that was a hot matter of topic and debate during the Persian period. Alright, Lamentations. This word comes from the word lament, meaning an expression of grief. The grief here is due to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. This helps us to date the book to somewhere around this time of this event. Traditionally, the author is said to have been the prophet Jeremiah. That's why Lamentations is placed directly after Jeremiah in the Christian Bibles. But again, it's possible that the book was actually written by 5 different authors, because it is made up of 5 separate poems, each of which are one chapter, and each of which being written in very different styles. They do have all one common feature in that they are all structured on the Hebrew alphabet. The first 4 are all acrostics, meaning each line starts with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The 5th poem is not an acrostic, but it does have 22 lines corresponding to the exact numbers of letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Now Ecclesiastes, which in the Hebrew is Kohelet, meaning something like a leader over an assembly or a meeting. Traditionally, the author is said to have been King Solomon, but once again, the language used points to a much later date. Very much like Ruth, it was probably written by an anonymous author during the Persian period. Ecclesiastes is kind of weirdly funny in that it's very highly pessimistic and yet inspires authors and poets for centuries, including the likes of Shakespeare, Tolstoy, and Hemingway. Taking pretty depressing texts and having it inspire others is a pretty strong example of the Bible's influence on Western culture, so that even those who don't know anything about the Bible are pretty familiar with many phrases that come from it. Phrases like eat, drink, and be merry, or there's nothing new under the sun, or turn, turn, turn by the birds, which is completely taken from Ecclesiastes. The final book of the writings in this set of 5 is Esther. This is the only book in the entire Bible that doesn't mention God, not even once. The only book in the Hebrew Bible that was not found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, which makes it highly likely one of the last books to be included in the Jewish canon. For Jews, this story is quite cleverly a comedy, and it's over-the-top characters to the almost slapstick situations they find themselves in. It's very clear the whole thing was designed to be more of a fictional play than a historical account. The setting can be sensed in a way that the Jews celebrate the festival of Purim today. Most Jewish holidays tend to be a little bit more serious, but Purim is the party day where people dress up in costumes and people get their drink on, big time. Esther is set during the Persian period, so it could not have been written before that, likely during the early Greek period. And the good old Persian days provides a pretty good setting for a pretty funny story. Side note here, it's very interesting that 2 characters named Ishtar and Marduk of the Mesopotamian stories have names that are super similar to Esther and Mordecai, which are the 2 main characters here. Highly likely this loosely based comedy was based on much earlier Ishtar and Marduk stories, which would have been very common in Babylonian culture. As we've seen, much of the content in the Hebrew Bible is based off material taken from other nearby cultures. The creation and flood accounts are very clearly based on Sumerian myths. Some of the book of Proverbs is taken directly from Egyptian texts. So does this mean that the ancient Israelites were just plagiarists and we should just ignore all their writings? Well, one of my hobbies is a DJ, and I love remixing music. I don't make it, but I can modify it and make something newer from it. My whole life, I've had a vast amount of knowledge of music and styles that allow me to pick up on themes and actually spot where there is influences in music or direct sampling from other musicians. So if I hear a song and can obviously spot where they've been sampled, does this mean I ignore the new track completely? Well, no. But does this mean I ignore the fact that this track has existed before? No. I can appreciate both. I can have my opinions and facts about both. I just can't have anyone besides myself forcing me to choose one song over the other. Obviously, not even the Bible made that distinction when it sampled the religion of its neighbors. One thing I cannot do in the case of obvious sampling is deny that it ever existed previously, even if someone puts a new spin on it. The ancient Israelites many times reused mythological stories and literary tropes that were common during their days. But they also changed things in small but important ways in order for them to communicate a point that supports the unique worldview. The Bible was not supposed to simply record literal history or to make factual scientific statements how we would make them today. Anyhow, moving on, we have Daniel being written very late in the Greek period. We'll get more into the book of Daniel another time. Which leaves Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. In the original version of the Tanakh were just 2 books. Ezra and Nehemiah were combined, and the books of Chronicles were combined. Now these books were very likely written by the same author or the same single school of authors. They edited them in such a way so that the end result was a unified story. A story that covered everything from Adam to the rebuilding of the temple. This is why much of the material in Chronicles is pretty much the same as the material in Samuel and Kings. It's basically retelling the same narrative from a different author. Traditionally, that author is said to have been Ezra, and that's also that Ezra was the person who put together the final version of the Torah. Now in this case, unlike the others, there is little reason or evidence to doubt the traditional view here, because the character of Ezra fits firmly within the historical setting rather than being a literary one. And that pretty much wraps up some of the historical facts of the Ketuvim.